All right, we're going to get this started. Welcome to Bridging Imagination and Evidence, Advancing MXR Research Excellence and Rigor, a title I'm sure was developed by ChatGPT, if I'm not incorrect. I'm Susan Persky. I'm going to moderate this session as well as speak in it a little bit later. I first, though, will introduce a man who in this venue needs no introduction. I'm going to give him one anyway. First up will be Dr. Brennan Spiegel, who is the Director of Health Services Research and the Director of the Cedars-Sinai Center for Outcomes Research and Education. I still have to write that one down. It looks like my slides are up on the monitor, so I just want to make sure that we're good to go with Brennan's slides. But I will call him up here to talk about improving the science of MXR.
All right, everyone. How's everyone doing? This conference is going okay? You guys learning some things? All right, good. Good. That's good. All right, well, thank you all for coming to this session. We're really excited about this session to hear from all of these experts. Dr. Persky, Susan's been amazing to work with. We've been working with her for about 5 years on an NIH grant that we're just finishing. It's a really large randomized control trial, and we'll be presenting those results soon. So really excited about that. But more on that maybe next year or in the months to come. Today, I'm going to talk briefly, just like 10 minutes or so, about a framework that we created several years ago to help researchers think about validating and developing applications in MXR. And I'm starting with this picture, which I showed you earlier today. This was a picture from a study that we did several years ago where we worked directly with end users, in this case parishioners at a church, to co-develop a program for hypertension management. And I'm starting with this because we'll talk a lot about methods today, what's the right control condition, so on and so forth, the regulatory landscape, and so on. But I want to start by saying the first steps in developing and validating a program in this space is to work with the people who are going to use the program. We can think whatever we want in our heads. It doesn't matter until we work with the end users. In this case, it's patients. In other cases, it might be providers. But to co-participate, I see a Sue here. So, participatory research to work with the end users collaboratively. And that's what we're going to talk about for the first part of my talk. And this is, I showed you earlier, this great quote from the pastor whose church we worked in, where he talked about this idea of inviting people into catalytic spaces so they can participate in meaningful engagement. So this is part of the research process. The first part of the research process is to sit down and talk with people who may or may not actually be interested in your ideas around app development. And that's the first thing I got to figure out, because we're in a room like this with a lot of very open-minded technological evangelists. What I'm showing you here is the famous diffusion of innovation curve by Everett Rogers. He wrote this very important book in the early 1960s on the diffusion of innovations. And in it, he described the technology adoption life cycle. And the idea is there's always going to be a small group of evangelists who are really excited about some technology. And that's on the left side of this curve here. And then there has to be a certain number of them in order for it to finally start to catch on. And that he called the chasm. Once you cross the chasm, then you start working your way up through the early adopters, early majority, late majority, and what he called the laggards. And so many of us are over in here, maybe forgetting that most everybody is over here. So to get over that chasm, we have to make sure that we're creating things that everyone's interested in using, not just the people who we imagine think like we do. And by the way, that's not like we're special. There may be perfectly great ideas that we have that are not great ideas. They're actually not going to take off. They're not going to be of interest to other people for perfectly good reasons. So that's why the first step in the model I'm going to describe to you now is about working with end users early and often when you have a new idea. And so you guys know what movie this is from? Okay, so you can tell how old people are by whether they can answer this question correctly. It's actually sad. I actually showed this to my students recently, and there was silence. I said, what movie is this from? Yeah, that's what I said. No one answered, though. Okay. I said, like, it's Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you build it, they will not come. Okay? It's just because you build something doesn't mean anyone's going to come or anyone's going to use it or anyone's going to be interested in it or anyone wants to invest in it. So that's sort of the starting point. Digital health, I said this morning, is not solely a computer science or an engineering science. It's a social and behavioral science also. And that's what I want to focus on here, because to develop programs from the ground up requires health design thinking. And this is a textbook that we've used in our graduate school to help our students learn more about health design thinking and the steps that are involved in working directly with end users, like I said early and often, to empathize, define the problem, ideate with them, prototype, test, and implement. And so all the steps in here are beyond what we have time for today, but this is an excellent document that I give as required reading for all of the students in our digital health science program in our graduate school. It's called the Ideas Framework for Strategies for the Development of More Effective Digital Interventions to Change Health Behaviors, because that's a lot of what we're doing in this room is we're trying to modify health behaviors, to eat differently, to take your medications more often, to see the doctor, to exercise. There's a whole list of behaviors that we're trying to influence, and there's a whole science around how to do that. And so this is one text that I really recommend. And in it, it goes through the details of starting from empathizing all the way out to evaluating and sharing. So we're going to talk today about a few of these as we hear from the different speakers, but I'm starting my presentation on the front end of empathizing, specifying, and grounding. Now, this is not new stuff. We've had guidance for making better apps that go back decades now, and a lot of this literature has just been lost. It's like people are always coming up with brand new ideas of how we should do something when it's already kind of been worked out and codified and documented. In this case, a lot of this work was by HRQ. For example, designing consumer health IT. This was before we even had iPhones. It used to be called consumer health IT. Now we just call it, I don't know, like iPhones, or we call it digital health, or we have new names for it. But there were guides for how to do this and recommendations, for example, to assemble a team consisting of members with appropriate knowledge and skills. Maybe you need a behavioral health expert on your team, an informatics expert on your team. Who do you need on your team to develop the program? And it's already been laid out in these documents going back many years. Understanding the needs of the end user in the environment in which they will be using the product or the treatment, if it's a treatment. Again, these are just best practices for developing these things. Making sure you have a diverse set of customers when generating ideas for new products, age, gender, literacy, etc. Understanding different personas, different phenotypes. Again, all of this has been worked out in the past, so I'm not going to go over this in detail right now, but I will say that years ago now, it was in 2019, a group came together called the VR Core, the virtual reality at the time VR as opposed to XR, clinical outcomes research experts came together to create this document, Recommendations for Methodology of VR Clinical Trials in Healthcare by an international working group. And many of those individuals are here in the room or at this conference, some are not. From all around the world, people came together to develop a framework for how to develop, validate, and test virtual reality programs. And the resulting document describes 3 phases, VR1, VR2, and VR3. And as I was looking down at the posters downstairs, I was putting into my head, where is this a VR1 study, a VR2 study, or a VR3 study? And sometimes they fall in between. So it's kind of like FDA has phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 for pharmaceuticals. This is a similar framework that was developed years ago. What are these different stages? VR1 is what I've been talking about. This is about human-centered design. This is about talking to people, doing grounded research, focus groups, interviews, finding out what their unmet needs are, knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, preferences, and taking all of that in with a social scientist typically to then start to develop the ideas behind the app that you're trying to create. And this isn't meant to read, but it's more to just take in that there are many different steps involved in empathizing with the end users, co-ideating through team collaboration, and prototyping through continuous user feedback. So that's all listed in this study. This is an example of a VR1 study that we published a few years ago around an app we created to help with gastrointestinal distress. So we worked with patients who had irritable bowel syndrome in this case, to create this environment. And one of the ideas that we heard from the patients is, wouldn't it be great if there were this like robot who could bring you through this virtual clinic? And so we actually started prototyping this. You can see this is from November 2020. This robot ended up becoming the robot that we showed you this morning in the Apple Vision Pro. And this was an idea from patients from 4 years ago. And it's just evolved over the years. And then we are able to take those ideas, those storyboards, and start co-developing actual three-dimensional environments with them to develop the software. So that's the VR1, and there's a lot of detail in it. The VR2 is now going a step further. Now you have the software. How do you initially test it with patients? Not yet in a randomized controlled trial, but just to understand feasibility, acceptability, tolerability, and initial evidence of clinical efficacy. And so once again, this is a busy table that I'm not going to read, but just to take in all the different best practices that the VR core team has already put into text. So this is a really helpful checklist to look through all of those stages. What do we mean by feasibility and acceptability and tolerability? How do we think about early evidence of clinical efficacy? And all of that has been addressed in detail on the right here, and then all of that's been written out in detail. So you can check this out if you want to learn more. And then there's the VR3 study. This is now we get to the point where we develop something in partnership with end users. It seems to be acceptable. It seems to be tolerable. There's some early evidence that it may be effective. It doesn't seem to be harming people. It seems to be safe, well tolerated, et cetera. Now we have to do a proper randomized controlled trial. This is an example of a study we're doing right now that I mentioned earlier that Dr. Persky has been helping us with. This is a 3-arm randomized controlled trial looking at sham VR. We're going to hear about control conditions shortly. Distraction-based VR versus skills-based VR for people with chronic lower back pain. And so this is a study which is what I would call a VR3 study. This is a large randomized controlled trial that has been powered to identify a clinically relevant endpoint in a diverse group of patients who have the condition of interest. And in this case, we've written out the entire protocol and have published this protocol. So you would see things like consort diagrams and what is the method of randomization and what are the outcome measures and what is a minimally clinically important difference or an MCID on those outcome measures that we're trying to achieve in order to power this study. Basic best practices in randomized controlled trials, that's what we mean by a VR3 study. And once again, there's lots of details that you can take in here that go through what we mean by that. So I'm just going to end there by saying if you build it, they may not come. But ideally, if you follow the VR 1, 2, and 3 guidance, they're more likely to come by the time you build it. So I'm going to end there, and thanks for your attention.